everybody, welcome back to my channel. Welcome. Today I have a very special treat as part of the rewards for my shooting star patrons on Patreon. I am going to do a little bedtime story. Now, if you don't know what Patreon is, all the information is down below in the description box. You can go check it out in general. There's some amazing artists, musicians, podcasts, authors, all kinds of people on there. You can also check out mine if you're interested at all. And today's video is dedicated to my shooting star patrons. And I would like to call them out a little bit by name here. Not a little bit, a lot actually. So my shooting stars, Corinne, Rachel, Cheryl, Teresa, Flu, Passiflora, Phil, and Vengeance. Thank you so much for your patronage, and I hope you enjoy your video. So today, we are going to be reading a bedtime story, which means I am going to be reading a few chapters from this book. Now, you may remember this book from the birthday book haul, if I've posted it yet. If I haven't, you'll see it soon. This book was given to me by my friend Flu, who's also one of my patrons, and it was one of her favorites when she was a child. It is Ronia, the Robber's Daughter by Astrid Lindgren. And today we're going to be reading the first 3 chapters. So, it's not really a bedtime story or a story time without a funny hat. That's the way we go. So allow me to don my bedtime story attire. Excellent. Now then, we're ready to go. So without further ado, let's read the back really quick of The Robber's Daughter by Astrid Lindgren. Got a great little cover there. On the night Ronia was born, a thunderstorm raged over the mountain. But in Matt's castle and among his band of robbers there was only joy. For Matt now had a spirited little black-haired daughter. Soon Ronia learns to dance and yell with the robbers, but it is alone in the forest that she feels truly at home. Then one day Ronia meets Burke, the son of Matt's arch-enemy. Soon after, Ronia and Burke become friends. The worst quarrel ever between the rival bands erupts. And Ronia and Burke are right in the middle. Sounds good, doesn't it? All right, so settle in. Get yourself some tea. Or just as I do, water, honey, and lead. And let's get started with bedtime story. Here we go. Chapter 1 of Ronia, the Robber's Daughter by Astrid Lindgren. On the night that Ronia was born, a thunderstorm was raging over the mountains. Such a storm that all the goblin folk in Matt's forest crept back in terror to their holes and hiding places. Only the fierce harpies preferred stormy weather to any other and flew, shrieking and hooting, around the robbers' stronghold on Matt's mountain. Their noise disturbed Lovis, who was lying within, preparing to give birth, and she said to Matt, "Drive the hell harpies away and let me have some quiet, otherwise I can't hear what I'm singing." The fact was that Lovis liked to sing while she was having her baby. It made things easier, she insisted, and the baby would probably be all the jollier if it arrived on Earth to the sound of a song. Matt took his crossbow and shot off a few arrows through one of the arrow slits of the fort. "Be off with you, harpies!" he shouted. "I'm going to have a baby tonight! Get that into your heads, you hags!" "Ho-ho! He's going to have a baby tonight!" hooted the harpies. "A thunder and lightning baby, small and ugly it'll be, ho-ho-ho!" Then Matt shot again, straight into the flock, but they simply jeered at him and flew off across the treetops, hooting angrily. While Lovis lay there giving birth and singing, and while Matt quelled the wild harpies as best he could, his robbers were sitting by the fire down in the great stone hall, eating and drinking and behaving as rowdily as the harpies themselves. After all, they had to do something while they waited, and all 12 of them were waiting for what was about to happen up there in the tower room. No child had ever been born in Matt's fort in all their robber days there. Noddle Pete was waiting most of all. "That robber baby had better come soon," he said. "I'm old and rickety, and my robbing days will soon be over. It would be fine to see a new robber chief here before I'm finished." He had scarcely stopped speaking when the door opened and Matt rushed in, quite witless and with delight. He raced all the way around the hall, leaping high with joy and shrieking like a madman. "I've got a child! Do you hear me? I've got a child!" "What sort of child is it?" asked Noddle Pete over in his corner. A robber's daughter! Joy and gladness! Shouted Matt. A robber's daughter! Here she comes. And over the high threshold stepped Lovis with her baby in her arms. All the robber's noise turned off at once. I do believe that's made your beer go down the wrong way, said Matt. He took the baby girl from Lovis and carried her around among the robbers. Here! Want to see the most beautiful child ever born in a robber's fort. His daughter lay there in his arms, looking up at him with wide, bright eyes. That child understands just about everything already. You can see that, said Matt. What will you call her? Asked Noddle Pete. Ronia, said Lovis. I decided that a long time ago. What if it had been a boy? Said Noddle Pete. Lovis gave him a calm, stern look. If I decide my baby is to be called Ronia, it will be a Ronia. Then she turned to Matt. Shall I take her now? But Matt did not want to hand over his daughter. He stood there gazing in admiration at her clear eyes, her little mouth, her black tufts of hair, her helpless hands, and he trembled with love. You, baby, you're already holding my robber heart in those little hands, he said. I don't understand it, but that's how it is. Could I hold her for a bit? Noddle Pete asked, and Matt laid Ronia in his arms as if she were a golden egg. I give you the new robber chieftain you've been talking about all this time. Don't drop her, whatever you do, or it will be your last hour. But Noddle Pete just smiled, his toothless smile at Ronia. There's no real weight to her, he said, surprised, raising and lowering her a couple of times. That made Matt angry, and he snatched his baby back. What did you expect, numbskull? A great fat robber chieftain with a bulging belly and a pointed beard, eh? All the robbers realized then that there must be no comments about this child if they wanted to keep Matt in a good mood. And it really was not wise to annoy him, so they set to work at once, praising and extolling the newborn baby. They also emptied a great many tankards of beer in her honor, which made Matt happy. He threw himself down at his high seat among them and showed off his remarkable child again and again. This is going to plague the life out of Borka, said Matt. He can sit there in his miserable robber's den and gnash his teeth with jealousy. Yes, death and destruction. There will be such a gnashing that all the wild harpies and grey dwarfs in Borka's wood will hold their ears, believe me. Noddle Pete nodded gleefully and said with a little snigger, Sure enough, it will plague the life out of Borka. Now Matt's line will live on, but Borka's line will be finished and done for. Yes, said Matt. Finished and done for, sure as death. As far as I know, Borka has not managed to get a child, and is not likely to either. Then there came a crack of thunder, the like of which had never been heard before in Matt's wood. It made even the robbers turn pale, and Noddle Pete fell flat on his back, weak as he was. A piteous little cry came unexpectedly from Ronia, and that shook Matt worse than the thunderclap. My child's crying! He shrieked. What do we do? What do we do? But Lovis was standing by calmly. She took the baby from him and put her to her breast, and there was no more crying. That was a good crack, said Noddle Pete, when he had too calmed down. I'll take my dying oath it struck. Yes, the lightning had struck, and in earnest too, as they saw when morning came. The ancient fortress high up on Matt's mountain had been cleft down the middle. From the highest battlements and the deepest vault of the dungeon, the fortress was now split in two halves, with a chasm between them. Ronia, your young life has gotten off to a grand start, said Lovis as she stood by the shattered wall with the baby in her arms looking at the disaster. Matt was raging like a wild animal. How could this have been allowed to happen to his forefather's old fortress? But Matt could not go on being angry about anything for long, and he could always find reasons to take comfort. Oh, well, we shan't have so many twists and turns and cellar pits and rubbish to keep track of. And perhaps no one will need to get lost in Matt's fort anymore. Remember what it was like when Noddle Pete went astray and didn't turn up for 4 days? Noddle Pete did not enjoy being reminded of this occasion. Was it his fault he had gotten lost? He had only been trying to find out how vast and rambling Matt's fort really was, and had indeed found it big enough to get lost in. Poor thing, he'd almost was half dead before he finally found his way back to the great stone hall. Thank goodness the robbers had been bawling and kicking up enough noise for him to hear them a long way off. Otherwise he would never have gotten back. In any case, we have never used the whole fort, said Matt, and we will go on living in our hall and bedrooms and tower rooms where we have always lived. The only thing that annoys me is that we have lost our outhouse. Yes, death and destruction. It's on the other side of the chasm now, and I'm sorry for anyone who can't contain himself until we manage to build a new one. But that was soon dealt with. and life in Matt's fort went on exactly as before, except now there was a child there. A little child who succeeded bit by bit in sending Matt and all of his robbers more or less mad, in Lovis's view. Not that it hurt them to become a little gentler-handed and milder-mannered, but there should have been moderation in all things. And it really was strange to see 12 robbers and one robber chieftain sitting there like a lot of sheep, beaming and blissful just because a small child had learned to crawl across the stone hall, as if there had never been a greater miracle on earth. It was true that Ronia scampered about unusually fast because she had a trick of pushing off with her left foot, which the robbers thought absolutely astounding. But after all, most children do learn to crawl, as Lovis said, without loud cheers, and without their father seeking it as a reason to forget everything else and positively neglect his work. "Do you want Borka to take over all the robbing in Matt's forest as well?" she asked sharply, when the robbers, with Matt at their head, came storming home early just because they had to see Ronia eating her porridge before Lovis put her in her hanging cradle for the night. But Matt had no ears for such talk. "Ronia mine, my little pigeon," he shouted as Ronia, shoving hard with her left foot, came shooting across the floor toward him as soon as he walked through the door. And he sat with his little pigeon on his knee and fed her porridge while his 12 robbers looked on. The porridge bowl was standing on the hearth at arm's reach, and as Matt was rather clumsy with his rough robber's fists, a lot of porridge got spilled on the floor. And Ronia knocked the spoon from time to time, so that a good deal of porridge also flew into Matt's eyebrows. The first time it happened, the robbers laughed so uproariously that Ronia was frightened and began to cry, but she soon realized that she had hit on something amusing to do, and did it again, which delighted the robbers more than it amused Matt. But otherwise Matt thought that everything Ronia did was incomparable, and that she herself had not her equal on earth. Even Lovis had to laugh when she saw Matt sitting there with his child on his knee and porridge on his eyebrows. "My dear Matt, who would ever think that you were the most powerful robber chieftain in all the woods and mountains? If Borka saw you now, he would split his sides laughing." "I'd soon put a stop to that," Matt said calmly. Borka. Borka was the arch-enemy. Just as Borka's father and grandfather had been the arch-enemies of Matt's father and grandfather. Yes, since time immemorial, the Borkas and the Matts had been at loggerheads. They had always been robbers, with a terror to decent folk who had to pass with their horses and wagons to the deep forest where the robbers lurked. God help anyone whose way lies along Robber's Walk, people said, talking of the narrow mountain pass between Borka's wood and Matt's wood. There were always robbers on the lookout there, and whether they were Borka's robbers or Matt's robbers made little difference, at least to those who were robbed. But to Matt and Borka the difference was enormous. They fought for their lives over the booty, and even robbed each other without hesitation if there were not enough merchants passing through Robber's Walk. Ronia knew nothing of this. She was too young. She did not know that her father was a feared robber chieftain. To her, he was just the kind, bearded Matt who laughed and sang and shouted and gave her porridge, whom she loved. And she was growing up every day, and soon she began to explore the world around her. For a long time she had believed that the great stone hall was the whole world, and she liked it there. She was safe sitting under the great long table, playing with pebbles and pine cones that Matt brought home to her. And the stone hall was not a bad place for a child. You could have great fun there, and you could learn a lot. Ronia liked it when the robbers sang around the fire in the evenings. She sat quietly under the table listening until she knew all the robbers' ditties by heart. Then she joined in, her voice clear as a bell, and Matt was so astonished at his matchless child who sang so well. She taught herself to dance, too. If the robbers were in the mood, they would dance and leap around the room like madmen, and Ronia soon saw what to do. She danced and bounded and made robbers leap as well, to Matt's delight, and when afterward the robbers threw themselves down at the long table to slake their thirst with a tankard of beer, he bragged about his daughter. "She's as beautiful as a wild harpy, I'll have you know, as supple, as dark-eyed, as black-haired. You never saw such a splendid child in your lives, I'd have you know." And the robbers nodded and agreed with him, but Ronia sat silently under the table with her pebbles and pine cones, and when she saw the robbers' feet in their shaggy fur slippers, she pretended that they were unruly goats. She had seen some in the goat shed, where Lovis took her when she did the milking. But Ronia had seen little more than this during her short life. She knew nothing of what lay outside Matt's fort, and one fine day Matt realized, however little he liked it, that the time had come. "Lovis," he said to his wife, "our child must learn what it's like living in Matt's forest. Let her go." "Ah, so you've seen it at last," said Lovis. "It would have happened long ago if I'd had my way." And from then on, Ronia was free to wander at will, but first Matt had one or two things to say to her. "Watch out for wild harpies and grey dwarfs and Borca robbers," he said. "How will I know which are wild harpies and grey dwarfs and Borca robbers?" asked Ronia. "You'll find out," Matt said. "All right," said Ronia. "And watch out you don't get lost in the forest," said Matt. "What shall I do if I get lost in the forest?" Ronia asked. "Find the right path," Matt said. "All right," said Ronia. "And watch out you don't fall in the river," Matt said. "What shall I do if I fall in the river?" Ronia asked. "Swim," Matt said. "All right," said Ronia. "And watch out you don't stumble into Hell's Gap," Matt said. He meant the chasm that split Matt's fort in two. "What shall I do if I tumble into Hell's Gap?" You won't be doing anything else," Matt said, and then he gave a bellow as if all things evil had suddenly pierced his heart. "All right," said Ronia when Matt had finished bellowing. "I shan't fall into Hell's Gap. Is there anything else?" "There certainly is," said Matt, "but you'll find out bit by bit. Go now." Chapter 2. So Ronia went. She soon realized how stupid she had been. How could she have thought that the Great Stone Hall was the whole world? Not even the huge Matt's fort was the whole world. Not even the high Matt's mountain was the whole world. No, the whole world was bigger than Matt. It was so big that it took your breath away. Of course, she had heard Matt and Lovis talking about things beyond Matt's fort. They had talked of the river, but it was not until she could see how it came rushing in wild rapids from deep under Matt's mountain that she understood what rivers were. They had talked about the forest, but it was not until she saw it so dark and mysterious with all its rustling trees that she understood what forests were. And she laughed silently because rivers and forests were there. She could scarcely believe it. She followed the path straight into the wildest woods and came to the lake. Matt had told her that she must not go farther than that, and the lake lay there, black among the dark pines. Only the water lilies floating on its surface gleamed white. Ronia did not know they were water lilies, but she looked at them for a long time and laughed silently because water lilies were there. She stayed by the lake all day and did many things that she had never tried before. She threw pine cones into the water and tried to see if she could make them bob away just by splashing with her feet. She had never had so much fun before. Her feet felt so glad and free when she made them splash, and gladder still when she made them climb. There were great mossy boulders around the pool to climb on, and pine trees and fir trees to clamber in. Ronia climbed and clambered until the sun began to sink behind the wooden ridges. Then she ate the bread and drank the milk she had brought with her. She lay down on the moss to rest for a while, and the trees rustled high above her head. She lay there watching them and laughed silently because they were there. Then she fell asleep. When she woke up, the evening had grown dark and she could see the stars burning above the treetops. Then she realized that there was even more to the world than she had thought. And it made her sad that stars were there, but she could never reach them, no matter how far she stretched her arms toward them. Now she had been in the forest longer than she was allowed. Now she must go home, otherwise she knew Matt would be out of his mind. The stars were mirrored in the lake, everything else was deepest darkness, but she was used to darkness. It did not frighten her. How dark it was in Matt's fort on winter nights when the fire had gone out, darker than any wood. No, she was not afraid of darkness. Just as she was ready to go, she remembered the leather bag she had brought her food in. The bag was still up on the boulder where she had sat to eat, so she climbed up in the darkness to get it. She had the idea that here on the high boulder she was closer to the stars, and she stretched up her hands to see if she could pick some to take home with her in her leather bag. But it was no use, so she took her bag and began to climb down. Then she saw something that frightened her. Everywhere, among the trees, eyes were gleaming. There was a ring of eyes all around the stone watching her, and she had not noticed anything. Never before had she seen eyes that shone in the darkness, and she did not like them. "What do you want?" she cried, but got no answer. Instead, the eyes came closer. Slowly, a little bit at a time, they drew nearer and nearer, and she could hear a murmur of voices, strange, gray, old voices, murmuring and droning all together. "Grey dwarfs all! Human hair and grey dwarfs wool! Grey dwarfs all! Bite and strike! Grey dwarfs all! Bite and strike!" And suddenly they were right below the stone, extraordinary grey creatures which wished her ill. She could not see them, but she knew they were there, and it made her shudder. Now she knew how dangerous they were, the grey dwarfs Matt had told her to look out for. But it was too late now. For now they were beginning to beat on the stone with sticks and clubs or whatever else they had brought with them. There was such a bonging and donging and horrible hammering in the great silence that Ronia screamed, afraid for her life. When she screamed, the dwarf stopped banging. The new sound she heard was even worse. They had begun to climb upon the boulder, pressing in from all sides in the darkness. She could hear the scrape of their feet and their muttering voices. Grey dwarfs all, fight and strike. Then Romia screamed still louder in her despair and swung wildly around her with her leather bag. They would soon be on top of her, and they would bite her to death, she knew. Her first day in the forest would be her last. But at the very moment she heard a yell only Matt could roar so terribly. Yes, there he came, her Matt, with all his robbers, their torches flaring among the trees, and Matt's bellow echoing through the forest. "Be off, grey dwarfs! Go, before I slaughter you!" And then Ronia heard the thudding of small bodies throwing themselves off the boulder, and in the light of the torches she could see them too, little grey dwarfs fleeing in the darkness and vanishing. She sat on the leather bag and slid down the steep boulder. Matt was there in an instant, catching her in his arms, and she wept into his beard as he carried her home to Matt's fort. "Now you know what grey dwarfs are," said Matt, when they were sitting in front of the fire, warming Ronia's cold feet. "Yes, now I know what grey dwarfs are," said Ronia. "But what you don't know is how to deal with them," Matt said. "If you're frightened, they can feel it a long way off. That's when they get dangerous." "Yes," said Lovis, "that's true of all sorts of things, so the safest thing is not to be frightened in Matt's forest." "I'll remember that," said Ronia. Matt sighed and hugged her tightly. "But you do remember what I told you to watch out for." Yes, she remembered that. And in the days that followed, Ronia watched out for what was dangerous and practiced not being frightened. She was to be careful not to fall in the river, Matt had said, so she hopped, skipped, and jumped warily over the slippery stones along the river bank, where the river rushed most fiercely. She was to stay by the waterfalls. To reach them, she had to climb down Matt's mountain, which fell in a sheer drop to the river. That way she could also practice not being frightened. The first time it was difficult. She was so frightened that she had to shut her eyes. But bit by bit, she became more daring, and soon she knew where the crevices were, where she could place her feet, and where she had to cling with her toes in order to hang on and not pitch backward into rushing water. With what luck, she thought, to find a place where she could both watch out that she didn't fall in and practice not being frightened. So her days passed. Ronia watched out and practiced more than Matt and Lovis knew, and in the end she was like a healthy little animal, strong and agile and afraid of nothing. Not of great dwarfs, not of wild harpies, not of getting lost in the woods, and not of falling into the river. So far she had not begun to watch out for Hell's Gap, but she planned to start soon. Besides that, she had explored Matt's fort right up to the parapets. She found her way into all the deserted rooms where no one ever set foot. And she did not lose her way in underground passages, dark pits, and cellar vaults. The secret passages of the forest and the secret paths of the fortress. She knew them all now. But it was the forest she loved best, and there she ran free as long as the day lasted. When evening came and darkness fell and the fire was burning on the hearth in the stone hall, she would come home tired after all her watching out and practicing. That was when Matt and his robbers came back too from their expeditions, and Ronia sat in front of the fire with them and sang their robber songs. But of the robbers' life she knew nothing. She saw them come riding home in the evening with goods on their horses' backs, all kinds of goods in sacks and leather bags and chests and boxes. But no one had told her where it all came from, and she wondered about it no more than she wondered where the rain came from. Things were just there. She had noticed that before. Sometimes she heard them talking about Borka robbers, and then she remembered that she was supposed to watch out for them, too. But she had not seen any yet. "If Borka were not such a scoundrel, I'd almost feel sorry for him," Matt said one evening. "The soldiers hunt him in Borka's wood. He isn't left in peace for a moment these days. And they will soon smoke him out of his robber's den. Yes, he's a dirty devil, so it doesn't matter. But all the same." "The Borka robbers are all dirty devils, the lot of them," said Noodle Pete, and everyone agreed with him. Wasn't it lucky that Matt's robbers were so much better, Ronia thought. She looked at them as they sat at the long table slurping up their soup. They were bearded and unwashed and noisy and wild, but no one was going to call them dirty devils in her hearing. Noodle Pete and Shaggy, Pele and Fulix, Juco and Jep, Knuckles and Knot, Tapper and Torm, Bumper and Little Snip. They were all her friends, and would go through hell and high water for her sake, she well knew. "Glad I am to be in Matt's fort," said Matt. "We're as safe here as the fox in its lair and the eagle in its nest. If any soldiers are foolish enough to come here looking for trouble, they'll be sorry." "We'll send them straight to hell," Noodle Pete said happily. All the robbers agreed and laughed at the very thought of the fools who might try to get into Robber's fort. There it stood on the top of a cliff, inaccessible from every side. Only on the south side a narrow little brittle path zigzagged down the mountain and disappeared into the forest below. But on 3 sides Mat Fort had its sheer drop. What fool would attempt to climb there? The robbers jeered. For they had no idea where Ronia went to practice, not being frightened. And if they come up the bridle path, they'll be stopped dead at Wolf's Neck, said Mat. We can hold them there by rolling rocks at them, and other things too, for that matter. Other things too, for that matter, Noodle Pete echoed, sniggering as he thought of the way they could stop the soldiers at Wolf's Neck. I've caught many a wolf there in my day, he added, but I'm too old now, and won't be catching anything but my own fleas. Oh, ha ha, yes! Ronia knew it was sad for Noodle Pete to be so old, but she did not understand why soldiers and fools would come and make trouble at the Wolf's Neck. In any case, she was sleepy, and could not be bothered thinking about it. Instead, she crept onto her bed and lay awake until she had heard Lovis sing the wolf's song. As she did every evening when it was time for the robbers to leave the fire and go to their bedrooms. Only Ronia, Mat, and Lovis slept in the stone hall. Ronia liked lying in her bed and watching the fire flare up and die through the gap between the curtains while Lovis sang. As long as Ronia could remember, she had heard her mother singing the wolf's song at night. That meant it was time to sleep, but she thought happily before she closed her eyes, tomorrow I'll be getting up again. And as she sang, and up she sprang, as soon as the new day dawned. Whatever the weather, she could be out in the forest, and Lovis gave her bread in the leather bag to take along. You're a storm night child, said Lovis, and a witch night child too, and it's well known that they can easily turn into little savages, but just you take care that the harpies don't catch you. More than once Ronia had seen wild harpies soaring over the woods, and she had crept hurriedly away to hide. The harpies were the most dangerous of all the dangerous things in Mat's forest. You had to watch out for them if you wanted to go on living, Mat had told her. And it was mostly because of them that he had kept Ronia at home in the fort for so long. Beautiful, mad, and ferocious the harpies were, with stony eyes that searched the forest for something to tear with their sharp claws until it bled. But no wild harpies would scare Ronia away from her paths and places where she lived her lonely forest life. Yes, she was lonely, but she missed no one in particular. Whom would she miss? Her days were full of life and pleasure, but they passed so quickly. The summer was over. It was autumn now. The wild harpies always grew madder still when autumn came. One day they chased Ronia through the forest until she felt like things were getting really dangerous. Of course she could run like a fox, and of course she knew every hiding place in the forest, but the harpies pursued her stubbornly, and she heard their strident cries. "Ha-ho, pretty little human! Blood will run now! Ha!" She dove into the pool and swam under water to the other side, then crawled out and hid under a thick fir tree, and she could hear the harpies searching and screaming in their rage. "Where is the little human? Where is she? Where is she? Come out and we'll tear you and we'll scratch you. Blood will run! Ha-ha!" Ronia stayed in her hiding place until she saw the harpies disappearing over the treetops. She did not very much want to stay in the wood any longer just now, but there were many hours before nightfall and the wolf song, so it crossed her mind that now was the time to do what she had planned for so long. She would get up on the roof and look for Hell's Gap. She had heard many times the story of how Mat's fort had split in two the night she was born. Mat never tired of telling it. "Death and destruction! What a crack! You should have heard it." "Well, of course you did. Poor little newborn babe that you were." Bang! "We had 2 forts instead of 1, with a chasm in between. And never forget what I told you. Watch out for Hell's Gap." And that was exactly what she was going to do. It was the best thing she could do while the harpies went mad out there in the forest. She'd often been on the roof, but had never gone near the perilous chasm that opened so sharply without any protective parapet. Now she crawled forward on her stomach and peered into the depths. Ugh! It was worse than she had thought. She picked up one of the loose stones lying along the edge and dropped it, and she shivered when she heard the stone landing far, far below. The sound was so muffled and so far away. Yes, this was really a hole to watch out for. But the gap that separated the 2 halves of the fort was not particularly wide. One good jump would get you across it. But surely no one would be that crazy. No, but perhaps it would be a good way to watch out and practice in her usual fashion. Once again she looked down into the chasm. Oh, how deep! Then she looked around for the best place to make her leap. And then she saw something that almost made her fall into Hell's Gap with surprise. A little way off on the other side of the chasm, someone was sitting. Someone about her own size, dangling his legs over Hell's Gap. Ronia knew that she was not the only child in the world. She was simply the only child in Mat's fort and Mat's forest. But Lovis had said there were plenty of children in other places, and of 2 kinds. Those who would turn into Mats when they were big, and those who would turn into Lovises. Ronia herself would turn into a Lovis, but she knew in her heart that the one who was still sitting dangling with his legs over Hell's Gap would turn into a mat. He had not spotted her yet. Ronia watched him sitting there and laughed to herself because he was there. 3. Then he caught sight of her, and he laughed too. "I know who you are," he said. "You're that robber's daughter who runs in the woods. I saw you there once." "Who are you?" asked Ronia, "and how in the world did you get here?" "I am Burke Borkison, and I live here. We moved in last night." Ronia stared at him. "Who's we?" "Borka and Undis and me and our 12 robbers." It was a little time before she could take in the incredible words, but at last she said, "Do you mean that the whole of the North Fort is full of dirty devils?" He laughed. "No, there are only decent Borka robbers there. But over there, where you live, it's stuffed full of dirty devils. That's what they always say." So that was what they always said. She began to boil, but there was worse to come. "In any case," said Burke, "this isn't the North Fort anymore. Since last night it's called Borka's Keep. You just remember that." Ronia gasped with rage. Borka's Keep? That really was enough to choke you. What rogues they were, these Borka robbers, and that rascal grinning over there was one of them. "Death and destruction," she said. "You wait until Matt hears about this. Then you'll see all the Borka robbers scattered with one blow." "That's what you think," said Burke. But Ronia was thinking of Matt, and she shivered. She had seen him beside himself with rage and knew what it was like. Now Matt's fort was going to split in two all over again, she realized, and the thought made her groan. "What's the matter with you?" Burke asked. "Don't you feel well?" Ronia did not answer. She had heard enough now. Enough of rascally talk and impudence. Something would have to be done. Matt's robbers would be home soon, and then death and destruction. Every dirty little devil of a Borka robber would be out of Matt's fort faster than he came in. She got up to go, but then she saw what Burke was going to do. He was getting ready to fly across Hell's Gap. He was standing on the other side directly opposite her, and he was beginning to run. She screamed, "If you come over here, I'll give you such a punch your nose will fall in." "Ha ha!" said Burke, and leaped. He was over the chasm. "Follow that if you can," he said with a grin. He shouldn't have said that. It was more than she could stand. All right, he and his dirty boots had planted themselves on Matt's fort, but no Borka robber was going to go around performing leaps that one of Matt's robbers couldn't imitate. And she did. She herself did not know how it happened, but suddenly she was flying across Hell's Gap and had landed on the other side. "You're not so bad," said Burke, and a second later he had jumped with her. But Ronia had not waited for him. With another leap she flew back across the chasm. He would stand there staring at her for as long as he liked. "You were going to punch me. Why didn't you?" Burke said. "I'm coming." "So I see," said Ronia, and he came. But she did not wait for him this time either. Once again she jumped, and she intended to go on jumping until she had no breath left in her body, if necessary, in order to get away from him. Then neither of them spoke any more. They simply jumped. Frantically and furiously they jumped to and fro across Hell's Gap. Nothing was heard but their panting breath. Only the crows sitting on the parapets cawed from time to time. Otherwise, everything was deadly silent. It was as if the whole of Matt's fort was sitting there on its peak, holding its breath, waiting for something truly terrible to happen at any minute. Yes, soon we'll be finished up in Hell's Gap, Ronia thought. But then at least there will be an end to this everlasting leaping. Then came Burke, flying across the chasm again, straight toward her, and she got ready to jump back. She no longer had any idea how many times she had jumped. It felt as if she had never done anything but jump back and forth across ravines to escape from Borka riffraff. Then she saw Burke slip on a loose stone lying on the edge, just where he had landed, and she heard him yell before he vanished into the depths. After that, she heard only the crows. She shut her eyes and wished that this day had never happened, that Burke had not existed, and that they had never jumped. Finally, she wriggled forward on her stomach and looked down into the chasm. And there she saw Burke. He was standing on something right beneath her, a stone or a beam or whatever it was that was sticking out from the shattered walls. There was just enough room for his feet, but no more. There he stood, with the depths of Hell's Gap beneath him, his hands fumbling wildly for a hold, anything that could keep him from tumbling into the abyss. But he knew, and Ronia knew too, that without help, he could not get out. He would have to stand there until he could stand no more. They both knew it. And then there would no longer be a Burke Borkison. "Hang on," said Ronia, and he answered with a little grin. "Well, there's not much I can do here." But he was afraid. You could see that. Ronia tore off the braided leather rope she always carried rolled in a ball on her belt. It had helped her many times with all her climbing and clambering in her forest life. Now she made a big loop at one end of the rope and tied the other end around her body. Then she lowered the rope to Burke. She saw the gleam of hope in his eyes as the rope came dangling down over his head. Yes, it was just long as he needed, she saw, and that was just as well for this Borka rogue. Get this around you if you can, she said. Then you can start climbing when I tell you to, but not before. The storm that had struck on the night she was born had torn a block of stone out from the parapet. By stroke of luck, it lay not far from the edge of the chasm. Ronia lay down flat on her stomach behind the great stone, and then she called, "Start now!" And at once she felt the rope tighten around her waist. It hurt. Every tug on the rope as Bert climbed made her gasp with pain. Soon I'm going to split in half, just like Matt's fort, she thought, and she set her teeth to keep from screaming. Then suddenly the strain was gone, and there was Bert looking down at her. She continued to lie there, wondering as if she was still able to breathe, and he said, "So that's where you are?" "Yes, that's where I am," said Ronia. "Done enough jumping now?" "No, I'll have to jump once more. To get to the right side, I've got to go home to Burka's keep, you know." "Take off my leather rope first," Ronia said, getting up. "I don't want it to stay tied to you any longer than I have to." He pulled off the rope. "No, of course not," he said. "But after this, perhaps I'm tied to you all the same, without a rope." "Not on your life," said Ronia. "You and your Borka's keep. You go there, and you get out of here." She clenched her fist and punched him right on the nose. He laughed. "Don't you do that again. Take my advice. But it was nice of you to save my life, and I thank you for it." "Get out of here, I said Ronia, and ran off without looking around. But just as she reached the stone steps that led down from the parapet into Matt's fort, she heard Burke shout, "Hey, robber's daughter! I'll be seeing you." She turned her head and saw him gather himself for his last leap. "I hope you fall in again, dirty devil," she shouted back. It was even worse than she had expected. Matt fell into such a rage that even his robbers were frightened. But no one at first would believe her, and for once Matt was angry with her. "A bit of lying, pretending may be fun sometimes, but you've got to stop this make-believe. Borka robbers and Matt's fort indeed. What rubbish! It makes my blood boil, even though I know it's a lie." "It's not a lie," said Ronia, and once again she tried to tell him what she had learned from Burke. "You're lying," Matt said. "In the first place, Borka hasn't got a boy. He can't have any children. That's what they've always said." All the robbers sat there silent, not daring to speak, but at last Fulix opened his mouth. "Well, but they do say he has a boy all the same. They say Undis gave birth to him in sheer terror on the night there was such a bad storm, when we got Ronia, remember?" Matt's eyes widened. "And no one told me? What other deviltry is there that I should know?" He looked around furiously, and with a bellow, he grasped 2 beer tankers, and one in each fist, and flung them against the wall, making the beer gush out. "And now Borka's snake spawn is taking his ease on the roof of Matt's fort, and you, Ronia, have talked to him?" "He talked to me," said Ronia. With another yell, Matt picked up a leg of lamb that had been served on the long table and flung it at the wall so hard that the grease flew. "And that snake's spawn claimed, you say, that his heathen dog of a father has moved into the North Fort with the whole of his robber scum." Ronia was afraid that if Matt had to listen to much more, he would be so furious he would lose his wits. But fury was needed if the Borka robbers were to be thrown out, so she said, "Yes, and that's why it's called Borka's Keep. Just remember that." With a third yell, Matt picked up the soup cauldron that was hanging over the fire and flung it at the wall in a shower of soup. Lovis had sat silently listening and watching. Now she was angry, and it showed. She picked up a basket of eggs, freshly gathered from the chicken run, took them to Matt and said, "Here you are, but you'll have to clean up after yourself, remember." Matt took the eggs with a fearful howl and flung them at the wall one by one until the place was running with yolk. And then he cried, "Safe as a fox in its lair and the eagle in its nest. That's what I said." And now, big as he was, he threw himself on the floor, and there he lay, crying and shouting and cursing until Lovis was sick and tired of it. "Now that's enough," she said. "If you've got lice in your coat, robbing won't get rid of them. Get up and do something about it." The robbers were already sitting hungrily around the table. Lovis picked up the lamb from where it lay on the floor and wiped it off a little. "It's probably only a bit more tender," she said comfortingly, and began to carve thick slices for all her robbers. Matt got to his feet sullenly and took his seat at the table with the others, but he did not eat. He sat there with his dark tousled head in his hands and growled under his breath, sometimes giving a sigh so huge that it could be heard all around the stone hall. Then Ronia went over to him, put his arms around his neck, and laid her cheek against his. "Don't be sad," she said. "All you have to do is kick them out." "And that may be hard," said Matt heavily. They sat in front of the fire all evening trying to puzzle out what to do, how to get lice out of your coat, or rather how to get the Borka robbers out of Matt's fort when they had gotten a firm hold. That was what Matt wanted to know. But first and foremost, he wanted to know how those snakes in the grass, those thieving rats, had managed to get into the North Fort without a single one of Matt's robbers noticing anything. Everyone who wanted to reach Matt's fort on horseback or on foot had to pass through Wolf's Neck, and a watch was kept there day and night. And yet no one had seen hide nor hair of a Borka robber. Noddle Pete laughed scornfully. "Well, what do you think, Matt? That they've come strolling through Wolf's Neck and tell the guard, 'Sweet as you please, step aside, friend. We're planning to move into the North Fort this very night.'" "So which way did they come, if you know so much about it?" "Well, not through Wolf's Neck and the big fortress gate, by all accounts," said Noddle Pete. "From the north side, of course, where we haven't got a guard." "No, why should we keep a guard there? There's no entrance to the fort. It's just a sheer rock wall besides. Do you think they're like flies who can climb straight up into the air and then wiggle in through one or two narrow arrow slits?" Then something suddenly occurred to him, and he looked at Ronia. His eyes narrowed. "What were you doing up on the roof, anyway?" "I was watching out that I didn't fall into Hell's Gap," said Ronia. She was sorry now that she had not asked Burke a few questions. Perhaps he would have told her how Borka robbers had managed to get into the North Fort, but it was too late to think of that now. Matt set his guards for the night, not only at Wolf's Neck, but on the roof as well. "Borka's nerve is just too much," he said. "At any moment he'll come rushing over Hell's Gap like a wild bull and drive us out of Matt's fort, lock, stock, and barrel." He picked up his beer tankard and flung it at the wall, so hard that the beer splashed all over the stone hall. "I'm going to bed now, Lovis. Not to sleep, but to think and to curse and woe betide anyone who disturbs me." Ronia lay awake that night too. Everything had suddenly turned so wrong and miserable. Why should that be? That Burke, after all, she had been pleased when she'd first seen him, and now, when she had met someone of her own age at last, why did it have to be a nasty little Borka robber? And there we go. Bedtime story for my patrons. Thank you so much for joining me for this little installment. I hope to finish the tale of Ronia's daughter with you. And until next time, for the love of story, I hope you have a wonderful day.